Hi there. It's quiet now, and that's a good place to begin. What you're about to hear is not a fairy tale, though it may sound like one at first. Tonight we're tracing the silk thread of a royal marriage, a union so heavy, so shrouded in control and secrets, that few who stepped into it ever found peace again. This isn't the story of a villain and his victims, or of love lost in a palace hall. It's something gentler, sadder. A quiet reminder that sometimes the heaviest crowns rest on the heads of those most lost to themselves. Now, just before we begin, if stories like this help you drift off, or if you find comfort in sleepy history, whispered through the hush of centuries, you're welcome to subscribe or leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far these echoes of the past travel. Tonight's story is called The Mystery of Ferdinand VII, the darkest king in history. But don't worry, we won't throw you into chaos. We'll walk slowly, softly, starting with a moment that feels more like a fading sigh than a royal command. Because sometimes the darkest chapters begin not with a coronation, but with a corpse. You are a royal physician in Madrid, and the year is 1833. Outside, the lamps flicker gently across cobbled streets, and the air hangs thick with grief and candle smoke. Inside the palace, footsteps echo across polished marble floors. It's well past midnight, and you've been summoned not to save a life, but to tend to one that's already ended. King Ferdinand VII is dead. The candles beside his bed burn low, casting strange shadows across the room. But there's no weeping crowd. No dramatic wails of court ladies in black lace. No, this moment is colder, more clinical. Queen Maria Christina stands beside the bed, composed but pale. Her hands gloved her voice, trembling only slightly as she speaks. You've been called for something unusual. The task is whispered to you with such delicacy that you have to lean in to be sure you've heard correctly. You have. And suddenly you wish you hadn't. The king's body lies beneath layers of fine linen still waxen. Even in death he exudes a sort of presence like a stone dropped in still water. You hesitate before drawing back the covers. The queen nods. You do as asked. This is the beginning. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, restorer of the absolute monarchy, husband of 4 women, has long been remembered for his erratic rule and unyielding paranoia. But among court whispers behind velvet curtains, and among the scribbled margins of dusty letters, another story lived. One that no historian would publish officially, but that doctors' maids and exiled nobles would murmur when the doors were shut and the night was long. It begins with his body. You've read the reports. You've heard the stories. Strange anatomical features, inconsistencies that made royal marriage less about intimacy and more about negotiation. Rumors spoke of a king whose physicality itself defied expectations, exaggerated, uneven, medically curious. And it was this as much as his politics that shaped his legacy. Here in this final moment, you aren't preserving a relic. You're preserving a symbol. Not of love or lineage, but of something much heavier. What happens when personal shame is fused with national power, when private fear is written into public policy? You think back to the stories whispered in the palace kitchens, in the doctor's chambers, in the rustle of curtains. The strange cushions prepared for wedding nights, the doctor's kits laid out like ritual tools, the mismatched expectations between husband and wife, between king and queen, each side burdened with fear. Confusion and responsibility neither could name aloud. Ferdinand wasn't the worst ruler Spain had ever seen, but he may have been the loneliest. He came to the throne twice, and each time clung more tightly to his authority, as if brute control could replace what nature had withheld. When Napoleon's forces invaded in 1808, Ferdinand was briefly deposed, only to return years later and dismantle the liberal constitution his people had fought for. To him, freedom was chaos. Control was peace. And yet in his private life, nothing felt under control. One royal physician, not you, but another once wrote that the king's medical records were unlike anything he'd seen in Europe. He noted that certain elements of the monarch's development deviated sharply from what was understood to be physiologically typical. The records were sealed, never meant for public eyes. Historians still argue whether these notes were exaggerated by political enemies, or if they reflect deeper truths about Ferdinand's lifelong medical struggles. What is clear, though, is that his physical discomforts translated into an emotional volatility that left every courtier on edge. And it's not as if Ferdinand had a peaceful childhood to begin with. Born in 1784 to King Charles IV and Queen Maria Louisa Ferdinand, was the product of a union between first cousins. His parents were distant, distracted, and scandal-prone. His mother was rumored to have had a long-standing affair with Prime Minister Manuel de Godoy, a man who wielded more power than the king himself for much of Ferdinand's youth. In this world of shifting alliances, whispered betrayal, and parental indifference, young Ferdinand learned early to distrust everyone. He internalized it. He grew secretive, then guarded, then sharp-edged, and perhaps worst of all, isolated. He could not laugh easily, nor did he confide in anyone, even as a child. His body, his emotions, his fears, all tightly locked away. No wonder he ruled as he did. In a time when royal men were expected to be confident, virile, and commanding, Ferdinand was made to feel like the opposite. Not because he lacked power, but because his sense of self had been so deeply warped by the way others looked at him. And so he responded the only way he knew how, by looking back with suspicion, by punishing curiosity, by controlling every detail of the world around him. And yet here in this quiet room, as you finish your examination, you feel something unexpected. Not disgust, not pity, but sadness. Here lies a man who was never allowed to be anything but a king, never allowed to be soft or vulnerable or simply enough. Every marriage, every war, every policy, each one stained with the fingerprints of his internal unrest. It was never just about the throne. It was about the ghost that haunted it. And so you seal the reports, you give your nod to the waiting attendants, and you leave the room with slower steps than when you entered. History will record his death as the end of an era, but you know it was the quiet collapse of a man who had long since run out of places to hide. You leave the chamber and descend through the palace corridors, their marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, where your footsteps echo more than they ought to. The scent of beeswax, stale incense, and old fabric clings to the walls like a ghost. But it isn't the building that feels haunted. It's the memory of the man you've just left behind. And as you move farther from his bedchamber, you find yourself drawn back, not to his death, but to his beginning. Because Ferdinand VII was not simply born. He was constructed carefully, unnaturally, almost mathematically, by the forces of dynasty bloodline and centuries of royal tradition that had twisted into something more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. To understand why Ferdinand's marriages collapsed under the weight of expectation and secrecy, you have to go back to the thing he could never escape: his blood. Not metaphorically his literal blood. The kind that had been diluted and tangled through so many cycles of cousin marriage and political pairings that by the time he was born in 1784, he was more symbol than child. Born at El Escorial, a massive granite palace monastery north of Madrid, he was the son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Louisa of Parma, who were themselves first cousins. And that in Ferdinand's world was considered relatively mild. You see royal bloodlines across Europe, especially in Spain and Austria, prized purity of lineage above genetic health. Cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, and in rare cases even double first cousins were paired like breeding charts in a prize stable. The result, a lineage riddled with inherited disease, developmental disorders, and personality instability that would have had any modern geneticist waving red flags like carnival streamers. And Ferdinand. He didn't win the genetic lottery. If anything, he drew one of the worst hands the Bourbon dynasty had seen. Accounts from early court observers note that Ferdinand was unusually fragile as an infant, slow to walk, hypersensitive to light, prone to illness. Some even claimed he cried for hours when touched, though that may be exaggerated by political enemies writing after the fact. Still, there's little doubt his early childhood was marked by discomfort, overprotection, and isolation. What's more tragic is that none of this was treated as a concern. To the royal family, these signs weren't seen as medical red flags, but as quirks of a divine bloodline. If he was strange, they believed it was because he was chosen, special, meant for something. Historians still debate the extent to which Ferdinand's behavior stemmed from inherited conditions versus environmental stress. Was he simply a product of his upbringing, or were the foundations laid in his DNA long before he learned to speak? What is known is that as he aged into adolescence, his differences became harder to explain away. Court physicians, always discreet but endlessly curious, began keeping private notes on the prince's unusual development. One tidbit that survives buried deep in Vatican archives describes a young lord whose natural proportions are misaligned, most distressingly so. The wording is vague, as if the scribe didn't quite know how to phrase what he'd seen, without offending the dignity of the crown. And in a way, that hesitation became the theme of Ferdinand's life. No one wanted to say the truth outright. Not about his awkward posture, his temper, or the strangeness that followed him like a trailing cloak. Everyone around him whispered, giggled behind fans reported home to their own kings and courts, but no one ever helped him. Not in any way that mattered. And he in turn learned early to despise that silence. There's an irony here, soft and bitter. The same dynasty that insisted its sons be born from perfect bloodlines had created a child too fragile for the throne, and yet they gave him the crown anyway. Because there was no one else. And because admitting a mistake wasn't in the royal vocabulary. By the time Ferdinand was a teenager, he'd become increasingly isolated, not just physically but emotionally. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, was more interested in her rumored lover Godoy than in parenting. His father, Charles IV, preferred hunting to governing. Ferdinand grew up in a court thick with intrigue but thin on affection. It's said that the only warmth he regularly received was from his nurses, and even they rotated too frequently for comfort. One peculiar anecdote recorded decades later in a private memoir by a chamber musician claimed that the young prince used to visit the royal stables not to ride, but to speak to the horses. He would stand for hours in the stalls, whispering into their ears, stroking their manes. Not in madness, the musician insisted, but in search of something gentler than what he found in people. It's a small detail, but a telling one. And still expectations loomed. Ferdinand was the heir, the future king. He would need a queen, heirs of his own, and a presence befitting his station. But he already knew deep down that something was wrong, that the very thing everyone expected of him might be the one thing he could never fully deliver. Even so, plans were made. Tutors were brought in, etiquette was drilled, and when he smiled awkwardly at diplomats, they praised his seriousness as a sign of early leadership. No one said the word awkward. No one mentioned how he flinched when touched, or how he couldn't meet anyone's gaze for more than a second or two. They just pressed forward, building a future he hadn't asked for around a body and mind that were already cracking under the weight of pretending. Eventually, the whisper network around Ferdinand's development became so dense that his father had to take official notice. That's when the royal physicians were summoned. Not to help him, of course, but to report whether the heir would be usable, fit for duty, fertile. Their conclusions. Let's just say the results were delivered verbally, never written down. But whatever was said, whatever fears were confirmed or politely avoided, No one made changes. The marriage plans continued. The education, the grooming, the ceremonial appearances. And behind it all, a boy who had never been allowed to simply exist, kept folding himself into the image of a king, even though the seams didn't quite match. That's the part of this story that stays with you as you walk out of the palace, the way Ferdinand was shaped, not born into his role. How a lineage so obsessed with appearances created a child who could only live through illusion. How silence was mistaken for strength, and difference was mistaken for disgrace. And maybe if someone had stopped long enough to truly see him, not the heir, not the awkward boy prince, but the human behind both, we might not be telling this story tonight. But they didn't. And so we are. You don't realize how much silence he carried until you start tracing the boy he once was. Not the king, not the symbol, but the awkward child in the shadowed halls of El Escorial, and in that vast, echoing palace where every marble corridor led to something gilded and cold, Ferdinand walked without laughter. It's a strange image someone raised amid wealth and ceremony, but never quite touched by warmth. While other boys were riding horses and attending lessons on classical rhetoric, he was being dressed in stiff brocade and inspected by tutors who taught more fear than philosophy. His early years were shaped less by play and more by the performance of being royal. But even the performance was incomplete. Behind closed doors, the future king was watched closely, not out of love but out of worry. Attendants whispered about his delicate health, his aversion to physical contact, his long silences during meals. These weren't yet scandals, but they were signals, and everyone knew it. The Spanish court in the late 18th century was a strange place. It mixed the strict formality of old Catholic traditions with the erratic dramas of an increasingly insecure monarchy. Ferdinand's father, King Charles IV, was not known for decisiveness. His mother, Maria Luisa, often seemed more invested in her rumored lover, the powerful and ambitious Manuel de Godoy, than in her own children. In many ways, Ferdinand was raised by absence, by rooms too large, and voices too sharp by a family that spoke to him in titles not tenderness. There's a quiet cruelty in that kind of upbringing. No one hit him. No one locked him away. But no one truly saw him either. And so he began to see himself the way others seemed to, as something fragile, something strange. He learned to read facial expressions, not for kindness, but for danger. A too long glance, a faint smirk. To young Ferdinand, these weren't idle gestures. They were warnings. This growing hypersensitivity to the world around him didn't manifest in outbursts, not yet. Instead, it turned inward. He became withdrawn, suspicious. Tutors noted his intelligence, yes, but also his reticence. He could memorize Latin declensions and theological doctrine, but he struggled with open conversation. His answers were clipped, his gaze fleeting. One courtier once wrote that the prince regards company as if they were mirrors turned against him, reflecting not his image, but his deformities. The deformities, of course, were not openly discussed. Not then. But they lingered like smoke in the corners of the room. You see, Ferdinand's body didn't develop as expected. Reports quiet, always confidential, suggested abnormalities in proportion and symmetry. Some said he limped slightly. Others whispered about his spine or his walk. But the most persistent rumors surrounded his adolescence when his body began to change in ways the doctors couldn't explain and the family wouldn't discuss. One tidbit, almost too odd to believe, survives from a now-lost physician's letter, later quoted in a private memoir. It describes the prince needing specially cut garments, not due to stature, but for proportion. The writer doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. The implication was clear enough for anyone familiar with palace gossip. Historians still argue whether these anecdotes are rooted in truth, or magnified by scandal-loving diplomats, eager to discredit the Spanish crown. But the effect on Ferdinand himself is not debated. By all accounts, adolescence was a time of deepening anxiety. His body wasn't just changing, it was betraying him. and he in turn began to retreat from anything that might expose him. By his teenage years, the prince had become hyper-aware of how he was perceived. Servants were dismissed for lingering glances. Portraitists were instructed to paint only his good side, though no one ever clarified which side that was. One foreign ambassador noted that the prince maintains a polite distance from both men and women, as if contact itself were treason. This distance extended to his emotions. When his younger siblings played or laughed, Ferdinand remained still. He didn't scold them. He simply watched, unmoving. Some believed this was a sign of regal self-control. Others more quietly feared it was something else, a boy lost in thought. Or worse, a boy already beginning to resent those who lived more freely than he could. The pressure to marry only magnified this. The court needed heirs. The kingdom needed stability. And Ferdinand needed, well, no one quite knew what he needed. Not even Ferdinand. But he understood what was expected. A bride would be chosen. A wedding would be arranged. And he would step into the role he had been groomed for since birth. Still, behind closed doors, the uncertainty deepened. There are notes scattered, never published officially, from palace physicians who examined the prince in his late teens. Some wrote of physiological inconsistencies. Others used more poetic language. The vessel is crafted by royal lineage, yet its design is most uncommon. What they meant was that the prince's anatomy raised concerns not for health necessarily, but for marital compatibility. It was around this time that his attendants began noticing other changes too. Ferdinand became more private, more withdrawn. He refused to bathe unless alone. He ate quickly, almost defensively, as if worried someone might be observing too closely. And while the court prepared lavish plans for his future, Ferdinand prepared himself to survive it. One story, likely apocryphal but too perfect to ignore, tells of the prince requesting all the mirrors in his private suite be covered. Not because he feared vanity, but because he could not stand the reflection. Whether this happened or not, it matches the tone of everything we do know. This was a young man who had been made to feel ashamed of the very body that symbolized his nation's continuity. It's worth pausing here just briefly to reflect on the quiet tragedy of it all. Ferdinand VII would grow to be a king who demanded loyalty, who punished perceived slights, who clung to power, even when it cost his people dearly. But those patterns began here in the soft carpeted halls of adolescence, where he learned that his worth was conditional. That he could be royal, yes, but only if he performed that royalty perfectly. And so he rehearsed. He bowed at the right angles, held his tongue in public, and listened as others described his future in third person. But the fear never left him. It only grew more practiced, more controlled. Perhaps the most telling moment came during a state dinner on his 17th birthday. Dignitaries gathered, musicians played, and the room was awash in candlelight and celebration. Yet when it came time for the prince to speak to thank the court for their well wishes, he stood, opened his mouth, and said nothing. The silence lasted nearly 30 seconds before he bowed and sat down again. The applause was polite, uncertain. No one mentioned it afterward, because in that palace silence was always safer than truth. And Ferdinand, still just a boy, not yet a king, had already learned how to survive by saying nothing at all. The wedding of a crown prince is supposed to be the culmination of royal destiny. Trumpets, rose petals, embroidered garments, and the eyes of an empire. But for you watching quietly from the edge of the chamber, the ceremony feels oddly weightless, as if everyone in the room knows on some deep, unspoken level that what's unfolding is not a union of hearts, but a fragile performance meant to soothe expectations. And at the center of it stands Ferdinand. His eyes shadowed his mouth, set in a line of formal duty. Beside him, his new bride, Maria Antonia of Naples in Sicily, barely 17, radiates with nervous hope. She does not yet know what awaits her. Their marriage had been arranged years earlier, as most royal marriages were. But even among dynasties accustomed to cold practicality, this pairing carried a peculiar sense of imbalance. Maria Antonia was sweet, curious, and raised on stories of romantic courtship. She had been told, likely by over-enthusiastic ladies-in-waiting, that Ferdinand was called El Deseado, the Desired One, by the Spanish people. She imagined a kind, strong, misunderstood prince, waiting for a woman to see the goodness behind his solemn exterior. In the hours leading up to the ceremony, Maria Antonia had walked the palace halls, with the shy excitement of a girl entering her own fairy tale. She asked gentle questions about her future husband, what he liked to eat, whether he enjoyed music. A chambermaid later recalled that the princess had packed a silver locket with a miniature portrait of Ferdinand commissioned in Naples before she had ever met him. He looked heroic in the painting with soft curls and noble eyes. But it wasn't an honest likeness. Not really. The wedding itself was magnificent. Madrid glowed for days, banners fluttered from balconies, orchestras filled the streets, and cathedral bells rang out with the weight of national hope. Inside the cathedral, the altar gleamed with gold, and the guests whispered with approval at the bride's delicate veil and the groom's regal silence. On the surface, everything seemed right. But the silence would follow them behind closed doors. The first night in the royal chambers was supposed to mark the beginning of their private world together. Instead, it marked the beginning of her confusion and his growing despair. Historical records don't speak plainly about what happened that night. Royal biographies are notoriously cautious with such matters, but the palace diaries, personal letters, and second-hand accounts collected over the years paint a picture not of violence or cruelty, but of profound misalignment, emotional, physical, and human. The reality is this: Ferdinand's anxieties, long nurtured in isolation, had not magically disappeared with vows and ceremony. His fears about his body, about intimacy, about being seen, pressed in more tightly than ever, now that he was expected to perform not only as a ruler, but as a husband. And Maria Antonia. She was terrified, not by Ferdinand himself, but by the unexpected distance, the confusion, and the weight of a situation no one had prepared her for. She had grown up surrounded by the comforts of court life and the gentle rituals of piety. Her understanding of marriage was shaped by romantic novels and whispered advice. But none of it had prepared her for this, an encounter with a man so burdened by shame and silence that even closeness felt like danger. A tidbit survives in a letter from a lady-in-waiting, written weeks after the wedding. In it, she describes the queen as frightened, but determined like a bird perched too long on a ledge, unsure whether to fly or fall. The letter never mentions specifics. It didn't need to. In those days, people understood the codes. Over the following months, attempts were made to support the young couple. Physicians were consulted discreetly, of course. Spiritual advisors offered counsel. Meals were adjusted for health. Gentle tonics were prescribed. There was no talk of failure, only of hope deferred. The palace whispered politely and moved on. But inside their chambers, the tension deepened. Ferdinand, already prone to suspicion, began to interpret his wife's hesitation as judgment. He could not see her confusion as human. He saw it as rejection. Her gentle flinches, her quiet apologies, her retreat into prayer, these were not signs of discomfort to him. They were betrayals. And Maria Antonia, caught in a situation she could not name aloud, began to deteriorate emotionally. Her appetite faded. She wrote long, wandering letters to her family in Naples. Some days she would ask for fresh air, only to retreat after a few steps into the courtyard. Her once clear eyes began to dim. Still, no one intervened in any meaningful way, because in royal courts silence was protocol, and protocol was stronger than compassion. Historians still discuss whether Maria Antonia's early miscarriages were due to illness stress or something more mechanical in nature. There are records of multiple pregnancies, none of which reached term. The physicians wrote of constitutional frailty, a vague phrase often used, when a diagnosis could not or would not be made. One mainstream historical fact remains: Maria Antonia died in 1806, at just 21 years old. The official cause was tuberculosis, but many believed her health had been steadily weakening long before that. Some even suggested that emotional distress played a role. The Spanish court, of course, never confirmed such suspicions. A lesser-known tidbit, recorded by a Jesuit archivist decades later, describes a small wooden cross that Maria Antonia kept beside her bed. It was carved from olive wood brought from Naples. After her death, it was reportedly found with a letter tucked inside the base, too faded to read, but addressed, it seemed, to no one. Her death devastated her family, particularly her mother. But at court, life moved on. There were treaties to negotiate, portraits to commission, and of course another bride to find. Ferdinand did not speak often of his first wife in the years that followed, but those who served him noted a change. He became more withdrawn, more reactive, more obsessed with privacy. His nights grew longer, his trust thinner, and something else began to harden. Not just his heart, but his understanding of what a royal marriage was meant to be. He no longer hoped for partnership. He expected performance. From now on, intimacy would be measured not by affection, but by obedience. And though he may not have meant to, he began to look at the women around him, not as companions, but as responsibilities, to manage like territories or documents. He had learned the wrong lessons from grief. It's difficult as you listen to these echoes not to wonder what might have been different. If Ferdinand had grown up with gentler hands, if Maria Antonia had been heard, not merely observed, if silence had been replaced with sincerity. But history doesn't deal in what-ifs. It deals in consequences. And as the final candle is snuffed in her bedchamber, and the mourning lace is folded away, a new question begins to rise within the palace. Who will be the next queen, because Spain still needed an heir, and Ferdinand VII was still expected to produce one. When the next queen arrived, the palace felt less like a wedding hall, and more like a theater reopening after a brief intermission. Maria Isabel of Portugal was only 19 when she crossed the border to become the second queen consort to Ferdinand VII. Her journey was symbolic as much as it was diplomatic, uniting two Bourbon dynasties, Spain and Portugal, in yet another loop of royal bloodline strategy. And yet no fanfare could quite hide the unease that drifted behind the palace walls. You could feel it in the way the servants lowered their voices, in the way the musicians played, a little too precisely during the processions, and especially in the quiet sighs exchanged between older courtiers who had lived through the previous queen's final days. Maria Isabel had been raised in Lisbon, a lively court by comparison with music gardens, and just enough scandal to keep things interesting. She was known for her composure, and had a particular fondness for poetry, especially the verses of Garcilaso de la Vega, which she recited in her chambers, with a soft, thoughtful tone. She had been briefed, of course, on her new husband's sensitive disposition. The wording was diplomatic as it always was. There were no warnings, only suggestions: tread gently, avoid confrontation, be patient. And she tried, at first. What Maria Isabel didn't know was that by the time she arrived, Ferdinand had grown more entrenched in his routines and more suspicious of deviation. After the collapse of his first marriage, he had begun to lean heavily on private rituals, daily patterns, and carefully controlled settings to maintain his sense of authority and calm. These weren't official policies, but personal habits that blurred the line between preference and compulsion. He rearranged rooms with exact precision, dismissed staff for minor inconsistencies in behavior, and demanded that letters be read to him aloud in a voice of even tone, no inflection. Historians often describe this period of Ferdinand's life as the glass rule, a time when everything around him had to remain still, orderly, transparent. Any disturbance, no matter how slight, could cause him to break. Into this atmosphere came Maria Isabel, bright-eyed and sincere, carrying the hopes of 2 courts on her shoulders. She entered the marriage with quiet grace, dressed in gold-trimmed satin, and bowed her head gently during the vows. But as the doors closed behind her, she found herself living not in a partnership, but in a palace-sized chamber of protocols and boundaries. The royal apartments were adjusted once again. A new bedchamber was prepared, complete with furnishings, designed according to the head upholsterer, for comfort and modest restraint. That phrase appeared in the official inventory, and while it may have meant nothing more than conservative decor, some later speculated that it implied a continuation of Ferdinand's unusual approach to marital intimacy. Rumors had already circulated from the previous marriage about modified furnishings and mechanical arrangements designed for royal privacy. Nothing was ever confirmed, but the whispers continued, especially among the artisans who worked in silence and were paid handsomely to keep it. A quirky detail survives in a rarely cited housekeeping record from 1816 which lists an order for a custom-made chaise with asymmetrical curvature and dual armrests at uneven heights. Though the item was officially labeled as decorative, its dimensions and the secrecy surrounding its delivery sparked speculation. Some claimed it was commissioned for comfort during reading. Others believed it had a more intimate purpose. In truth, no one knows for certain. What is known is that Maria Isabel quickly began showing signs of emotional wear. Within months of her arrival, she became more reserved, more frequently unwell. Her physicians, trained in the euphemisms of court life, noted episodes of quiet fatigue and heightened sensitivity to climate. But the Queen was not simply sick. She was overwhelmed. The combination of intense scrutiny, emotional coldness, and pressure to conceive had taken a toll. In the spring of 1817, Maria Isabel suffered a miscarriage. Official announcements described it as a tragic accident, and the public responded with mourning and sympathy. But behind the scenes, the mood darkened. Ferdinand, already paranoid and fearful of failure, became more withdrawn. He reportedly paced outside his wife's rooms at night, muttering to himself and asking attendants to double-check her breathing. Some claimed he suspected poisoning. Others believed he feared divine punishment. Either way, he was not offering comfort. He was searching for control. Maria Isabel's health never fully recovered. That summer she grew pale and feverish, and her appetite vanished. Though records attribute her death to complications from a second miscarriage in December of that same year, the deeper causes, emotional exhaustion, unrelenting pressure, isolation, remain unspoken, but deeply felt in every line of her final letters home. One letter kept in the Royal Portuguese archives ends simply with the words, "Tell Father I tried to be what they needed. I hope that is enough." It's the kind of sentence that lingers. There were no grand accusations, no political intrigue, just a young woman folded beneath the weight of royal expectations in a marriage that demanded far more than it offered. Ferdinand, now twice widowed, did not attend her funeral procession in person. Instead, he issued a decree for a national day of mourning and retreated into his private chambers for nearly 2 weeks. When he emerged, he resumed his duties with increased rigidity. Policies were signed, audiences were granted, but something in his demeanor had changed. The pauses between sentences grew longer. The rooms he entered became quieter. The man who had once been described as merely awkward was now seen as haunted. Historians still debate whether Ferdinand's peculiar demands in marriage stemmed from medical necessity, psychological fear, or a distorted sense of control born from lifelong humiliation. Some argue that his behavior was a coping mechanism for trauma he could never articulate. Others see it as a symptom of unchecked authority combined with unresolved shame. The truth likely lies somewhere between. And yet amid all this speculation, the facts remain simple and sobering. 2 queens entered the palace with hope, and both left through the silence of death. No enemies, no uprisings. just the slow erosion of spirit under the weight of a crown that asked for everything and returned so little. You might think at this point that the court would slow down, that lessons would be learned, that gentler choices might be made. But the machinery of monarchy doesn't rest. A country needed an heir, and Ferdinand VII was still without one. The search would begin again, and the next woman to walk through those palace gates would not know, at least not yet, that she wasn't marrying a man. She was marrying the echo of everything he had lost and everything he refused to speak aloud. By the time Maria Josepha of Saxony arrived in Madrid, the palace had become a place where ghosts lingered. Not the kind that moan through halls or rattle chandeliers, but the kind that settle quietly behind curtains, in empty drawing rooms, and in the pages of unfinished letters tucked into forgotten drawers. 2 queens had died before her, both young, both hopeful, and both ultimately undone by a marriage that seemed to exist in a realm just slightly removed from reality. And now, as Maria Josepha stepped through the ornate gates, her footsteps joined the quiet echo of all the women who had come before. At 19, she was not naive, but neither was she prepared. She had been raised in the Saxon court, a place known for its musical refinement and Lutheran stoicism, where formality coexisted with quiet intellectualism. Maria Josepha had been taught Greek and Latin, and she could quote Seneca with a surprising sharpness for her age. She believed in duty, yes, but she also believed in dignity. And she walked into her new life with a blend of cautious optimism and a steeliness that set her slightly apart from her predecessors. Ferdinand, older now, had shifted. His edges had hardened, but not in the way of fury. Instead, it was as though he had grown layers of frost, a slow accumulation of emotional distance, built over years of disappointment and control. This third marriage, orchestrated with even more political calculation than the previous ones, was approached by him as something to be executed rather than lived. The rituals were completed with precision. The greetings were offered on cue. But the warmth was missing. One of the first things Maria Josepha noticed was how clinical the royal routines had become. Every detail of their time together was logged meticulously, not just by courtiers or ministers, but by physicians, advisors, and personal attendants. There were ledgers tracking meals, bedtimes, hours spent together, and hours spent apart. Even their intimate life, what little existed, was framed through the lens of medical evaluation and reproductive strategy. One account from a court chamberlain described how the royal bedroom was scheduled like a royal council. Visits were timed. Preparations were supervised by attendants trained not just in etiquette, but in health protocols. The atmosphere was less about intimacy and more about procedure. It was as if Maria Josepha had not married a man, but a mechanism one designed to produce an heir document the process, and repeat as needed. At first she complied. She was, after all, a daughter of discipline. But gradually the dehumanizing nature of her new existence began to wear her down. She started keeping her own diary written in Latin, perhaps, to protect it from prying eyes, and in it she noted the strange sense of being observed, but not seen, touched, but not held. The lines between personal and political had blurred beyond recognition, and then, inevitably, the medical professionals took over. A particularly respected physician, Don Bartolomé Palacios, was tasked with overseeing the Queen's reproductive health. He was careful, courteous, and thorough, but the mere fact that his involvement was so prominent speaks volumes about the dynamics of the marriage. Notes from his journals, now archived in Madrid's National Library, reveal a fascinating tidbit. The Queen's monthly cycles were charted on wall calendars shared between 3 departments: household, medical, and administrative. That level of record-keeping, while not entirely unique in royal courts, was unusually invasive even by 19th century standards. It wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. It was bureaucracy turned intimate. A love life replaced by time cards and temperature charts, Maria Josepha, trying to reclaim some form of autonomy, began requesting long walks through the palace gardens alone. She took up embroidery not for beauty, but for repetition, something rhythmic to keep her mind from unraveling. She found companionship in her lady-in-waiting, a clever older woman, named Doña Eulalia, who had served in the court for over 2 decades and had seen more than she ever spoke of. One day, Doña Eulalia gave her a gift, a hand-bound book of ancient Roman love poetry. Inside, she had underlined a single phrase, "What is love if not shared in truth?" Maria Josepha wept upon reading it. Still she endured. She was strong that way. But the marriage continued in its frozen cycle. There were no public arguments, no scandals, just a growing emotional vacuum that began to sap her spirit. Ferdinand, still obsessed with producing an heir, began doubling down on his routines. Meals became timed affairs. Conversations, when they happened, were short and perfunctory. Even moments of levity, a piano duet, or a game of cards felt like rehearsals. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's behavior during this time reflected deeper psychological issues, or if it was simply the product of royal pressure combined with personal pain. Some believe he was suffering from an undiagnosed condition, likely exacerbated by inbreeding, and a lifetime of repression. Others suggest he was fully aware of his choices, but had come to believe that his dignity depended on control. Either way, the effect on Maria Josepha was the same. She became ill just over a year into the marriage. At first it was described as nervous exhaustion, a term often used for women in her position. But the symptoms worsened quickly. Fainting spells, recurring fevers, and eventual confinement to her quarters. In early 1818, less than 18 months after her arrival, Maria Josepha died. The official cause was complications from an intestinal illness. Unofficially, people whispered that her spirit had simply faded. A small, poignant detail survives from the hours after her death. Her personal Bible was found open on a passage from Ecclesiastes. There is a time to be silent and a time to speak. Some interpreted it as coincidence. Others believed it was the Queen's final commentary on a life lived under quiet suffocation. Ferdinand, for his part, reacted with detached solemnity. He announced a full mourning period, attended a single ceremonial service, and then retreated once more into routine. By now he had grown accustomed to loss, but he had not grown from it. 3 queens, 3 tragedies, and yet the crown still sat heavy on his brow unchanged. You may wonder how such patterns could continue, how the most powerful man in Spain could continue marrying women only to outlive them in silence. But monarchy, especially absolute monarchy, is not a system built for introspection. It is built to endure, to function, and to survive its own consequences, however personal they may be. And Ferdinand VII, he was determined to survive, even if his queens did not. By now, the palace walls had memorized the pattern, a young queen full of promise, stepping into a marriage already shaped by grief, silence, and expectation. But when Maria Cristina of the 2 Sicilies arrived as Ferdinand VII's 4th wife, the atmosphere was strangely different. The court was quieter, more subdued, less hopeful. There were no grand parades, no festive songs flooding the streets. People still lined up, of course, because that's what one does when a new queen arrives. But their claps were soft and their faces uncertain. This wasn't a celebration. It was a routine. Maria Cristina, barely 23, was perhaps the most politically strategic of Ferdinand's queens. She had been carefully selected for 2 reasons. First, she was a niece of his 2nd wife, which helped tie the Bourbon lines tighter. Second, and more urgently, she was young, healthy, and presumed fertile. Spain needed an heir. The king was aging. The monarchy had no room left for failed attempts. But what no one said out loud, what no court scribe dared write, was that Ferdinand, now in his mid-40s, was not a man simply seeking companionship. He was a man racing against time, fighting not only political uncertainty, but the looming weight of his own fading legacy. From the very beginning, their marriage was scheduled like a military operation, and that's not poetic exaggeration. The palace's royal household book shows an updated routine titled Régimen de la Fertilidad Real, which listed new physician appointments, optimized dietary charts, room temperature controls, and even suggested hours for rest and productive union. The whole process was framed like a campaign timed, measured, and designed to deliver one result: a child. Maria Cristina, to her credit, complied. She was no fool. She knew the stakes. And she had grown up in a court not entirely unlike Madrid, one where queens were seen as vessels first and individuals second. So she played the part. She attended daily mass, walked the palace gardens with folded hands, and smiled graciously at the nobles who watched her every move. But inside her chambers, the experience was entirely different. Maria Cristina's bedroom became less a sanctuary than a carefully managed space, governed by a rotating team of physicians, midwives, attendants, and even clerics. The air was always slightly perfumed with lavender and clove, not because the queen preferred it, but because it was thought to improve womb receptivity. The windows were opened or closed according to charts matching her cycle. The bed linens were changed by a strict schedule. And worst of all, every moment of her physical state, from pulse to temperature, was documented and archived. It's not hard to imagine how such an environment could affect someone's mind. And indeed, Maria Cristina's letters reveal a quiet undercurrent of anxiety. In one letter to her sister, she wrote, "The king is kind in the way one might say a watchtower is kind, reliable, unmoving, and always watching." That sentence alone offers a glimpse into the emotional distance that defined their marriage. Still, Maria Cristina managed something no queen before her could. She became pregnant within the first year. The entire palace held its breath. Spain, politically fragile and desperate for stability, responded with joy and cautious optimism. Ferdinand himself seemed to soften, at least momentarily. He ordered fresh renovations to the nursery wing commissioned paintings, celebrating dynastic continuity, and, according to one courtier, allowed himself a rare smile at dinner. Not a laugh, just a smile. And then, in October 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, a girl. Technically, this was not the heir the court had been hoping for. A male heir would have erased all doubt and secured the line, but Ferdinand, perhaps because of age, perhaps out of desperation, declared Isabella the legitimate successor. He issued the pragmatic sanction revoking the ancient Salic law that barred women from inheriting the Spanish throne. With the stroke of a quill, he restructured centuries of patriarchal precedent. This move sparked what would later become the Carlist Wars, a devastating struggle over succession that would haunt Spain for decades. But in that moment, Ferdinand seemed almost at peace. He had an heir. His line, at least in his mind, would endure. But peace didn't last. Shortly after Isabella's birth, Ferdinand became consumed with doubt. Quiet at first, then louder. He began questioning the legitimacy of the child, not publicly, of course, but in whispers to his inner circle. He demanded paternity confirmations. He summoned doctors to inspect both mother and daughter. At one point, he reportedly asked whether Isabella's eye color matched his own. Court officials scrambled to assure him that she did indeed resemble him. But such reassurances rarely satisfy a man who has spent a lifetime haunted by secrets and shame. And there were still secrets, deep ones. In the final years of his life, Ferdinand's health declined rapidly. His body weakened, but his paranoia remained intact. He grew more suspicious, more reclusive. He began suffering from intense abdominal pain and feverish episodes, and was often confined to his private quarters, attended only by a select few physicians and his confessor. He signed decrees with a shaky hand and dictated orders with long pauses. Then came the autopsy. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, the physicians who conducted the examination made a note quietly in Latin, and not meant for public release, of what they found. Among their findings were signs of physical deformities, long suspected but never confirmed. More surprisingly, there were traces of what appeared to be repeated self-intervention scarring damage, and what one modern biographer gently described as evidence of surgical manipulation, inconsistent with any known medical treatment of the time. Historians still debate the meaning of these findings. Some argue that Ferdinand, desperate to fix himself, had resorted to private, even dangerous methods. Others suggest he may have undergone secret surgeries unknown to the public. A few have even questioned whether he received unlicensed treatments from foreign physicians during the years between his marriages. But all agree on one thing: Ferdinand's struggle was lifelong painful and never truly resolved. And perhaps that's the real tragedy, not just the failed marriages, the suspicion, the loss, but the fact that at the heart of it all was a man who could never simply speak his pain aloud. His fear became policy. His silence became law. And in the end, his personal battle left a national scar that outlived him. So what can you take from all this lying here now in the quiet dark? That absolute monarchy doesn't just twist nations. It twists people. It turns childhood shame into adult suspicion. It makes marriages into experiments. And it leaves behind daughters who must carry a father's fear like a crown. But not all royal marriages ended like Ferdinand's. From here, let's leave behind the shadows of Madrid and step into other palaces, other stories, where love sometimes bloomed even in impossible places. The room was hushed. Even for a royal birth, there was something unusually tense about this one. You can feel it in the way the midwives move, precise, almost ceremonial, as if history itself is holding its breath. It's October 10th, 1830, and in the palace of El Escorial, you as the attending courtier have just witnessed the arrival of a baby girl, a future queen, a moment that was supposed to bring peace, but instead would reopen all the old wounds that Ferdinand VII had tried to bury. He had done it, or rather Maria Cristina had. After a string of losses, humiliations, and marriages that ended in sadness, the king now had what he called my victory over misfortune. He named her Isabella II, future Queen of Spain. And in that moment, Ferdinand looked at her with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. It was not just pride, it was possession, as if she was both salvation and proof. She would carry his name. She would wear the crown. And most importantly, she would erase the whispers that had haunted his decades on the throne. But Ferdinand VII had never known how to sit comfortably with joy. It frightened him, because joy, unlike pain, was something he couldn't control. And that fear quickly turned into doubt. At first it was subtle. He would ask if Isabella's nose looked like his, then her earlobes, then her toes. He summoned physicians to examine the shape of her head. He ordered the court painter to create portraits of the infant, not to celebrate her, but to study her. Some say he compared these images to his own baby paintings. Others recall him mumbling about impostors' bloodlines and divine punishment. Maria Cristina, now more mother than queen, tried to shield her daughter from the king's obsessions, but it was like trying to stop a wave with a lace fan. And the thing is, Spain noticed. The nobles who had once laughed nervously at the king's peculiarities now kept their conversations short. Ambassadors from other nations began sending coded reports back home, raising concerns about the sovereign's faculties. Even the church, always careful to support the throne, found itself stepping lightly around royal declarations. Because Ferdinand's decision to make Isabella his heir was radical, it broke the Salic law, which for centuries had prohibited female succession. His brothers, especially Don Carlos, saw this as betrayal. They viewed it as both illegal and unnatural. And soon, what should have been a peaceful transition turned into the makings of civil war. Spain was now divided, not just by ideology, but by a baby in a cradle. Maria Cristina became both mother and political actor overnight. She stood beside the crib and signed decrees. She answered letters. She negotiated with ministers, all while soothing a monarch who, depending on the day, called their daughter his angel or a divine test. The irony, of course, is that Ferdinand had fought so hard for a legacy, and then seemed incapable of embracing it once it arrived. This is where the story begins to blur into something more psychological, where the palace becomes not a home, but a mirror. Every hallway reflecting Ferdinand's doubts. Every whisper sounding like confirmation that he had failed. As his health declined, these doubts festered. His body began to betray him slowly and painfully. He suffered from intense joint pain ulcers, fevered episodes that left him bedridden for days. His signature became shakier. His speeches, once long and theatrical, turned brief and disjointed. One minister wrote that he would often pause mid-sentence, forget the point, and then laugh quietly to himself like a man telling jokes no one else could hear. In those final months, his private chambers were sealed off. Only physicians, confessor, and Maria Cristina had access. The curtains remained closed. The food was bland and boiled. And somewhere behind all that velvet and incense, the king quietly unraveled. Which brings us to the autopsy. It was not public, of course. The death of a monarch is always wrapped in ritual. But those who conducted the examination carefully selected sworn to discretion recorded findings that would never appear in official documents. Among the usual causes of death, congestive issues, ulcers, advanced age were several entries noted in Latin, placed in the margins like apologies. They found anatomical abnormalities that confirmed what many had long suspected, but never dared to state aloud. There were signs of deformation consistent with congenital issues common among deeply inbred lines. But most alarming were the surgical scars. Not medical, not from a licensed procedure. They were described as repeated incisions, with irregular stitching, and internal trauma. In modern terms, self-surgery, not once but multiple times. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand performed these procedures himself, or whether he allowed some unlicensed individual to attempt them. What's agreed upon is that they were deeply invasive and never medically sanctioned. Some believe these acts were attempts to correct himself to restore function, or at least normalcy. Others think they were punishments, physical manifestations of the shame he carried since boyhood. And here the truth is perhaps more devastating than anything rumor could invent. He suffered, quietly, repeatedly, and alone. In the end, he wasn't a monster, nor a villain in some medieval cautionary tale. He was a man who had been born into a system that valued lineage over empathy, legacy over love, a system that rewarded silence and punished vulnerability. He was twisted not by choice, but by expectation. The king died on September 29th, 1833. The bells rang, the streets flooded, and somewhere inside the palace a tiny girl, barely 3 years old, was dressed in mourning robes too heavy for her shoulders. She would become queen. She would carry the legacy. And she would inherit not only a kingdom, but the pain of a man who could never tell the truth about himself. So tonight, if you're still awake, consider this. When we read history, we often look for heroes and villains. We ask, was he good or bad? But the story of Ferdinand VII doesn't give you that luxury, because it's not about good or bad, it's about what happens when power replaces compassion. When a crown becomes heavier than the head it rests upon. His story is not just about monarchy, it's about what happens when shame festers in silence, and how that silence, when given a throne, can echo across generations. Now let's travel forward and sideways. Let's step away from the shadows of Spain for a while and explore the lives of other royal husbands. Some strange, some sweet, and all surprising in their own ways. It's 1761, and you've just stepped into the sprawling corridors of Kew Palace in London. a surprisingly modest royal residence tucked along the banks of the Thames. The furniture is charmingly plain for a royal household, the ceilings low enough to brush with a candle. And yet, despite the modest trappings, the weight of the British Empire hums through the bricks and floorboards. Because here resides George III, the future Mad King who for now is a newly married man, with nothing but loyalty in his heart and earnestness in his eyes. And you, of course, are not just wandering the halls. You're the Queen, his Queen, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. And you're about to find out that being married to King George is a test of patience, resilience, and occasionally a test of your ability not to giggle when your husband starts talking to the trees. At first, though, it's all fresh linens and lavender water. George is doting famously faithful and rather famously awkward. He doesn't keep mistresses like most kings, and he certainly isn't known for theatrical cruelty or obsessive control. In fact, he insists on reading your letters, playing music with you, and strolling in the garden every evening, rain or shine. And no, this is not a trap. It's just George. A bit eccentric, yes, but deeply committed to being a good husband. He believes love must come before politics, which, considering you met only hours before your wedding, is either naive or sweet, depending on the weather and your mood. Your first few years together pass in a golden blur of children, 15 in total, though not all will survive in music. George is passionate about the arts and about you. He writes long, winding love letters, even after years of marriage, filled with phrases like "my dearest dear," and "you are the light that guides my weary soul." It's a lot, but it's genuine. He even builds a private retreat just for the two of you at Queen's Lodge in Windsor, where you can escape the formality of court life and spend time together just as ordinary spouses who happen to oversee an empire might do. Still, it's not all garden walks and harpsichords. The pressures of the crown start to wear on George early. The American colonies, those stubborn children across the Atlantic, are getting rebellious. And you can see it in your husband's eyes, the long stares, the furrowed brow, the midnight pacing. He tries to remain calm, drinking chamomile tea and consulting maps like they might whisper back solutions. But even you know he's slipping into something deeper, something more troubling. It begins with confusion, forgetting names, losing track of time, repeating himself. And then the outbursts. Sudden, irrational, often loud. At first, court physicians prescribed the usual things, bloodletting herbal teas and frequent walks. But none of it works. Soon you hear the whispers the king talks to trees. He believes he is no longer king. Or worse, he believes he's someone else entirely. One day he insists he is a farmer. Another day a soldier in ancient Rome. The court begins to panic. You try to hold things together. You don't run. You don't hide. You simply continue. You write to your children, manage the household, and meet with ministers when George cannot. Because that is what queens do. And it's not just a performance. You love him. You truly do. Even when he fails to recognize you, even when his eyes flash with terror, you remember the man who once held your hand under the elm trees and read poetry to you by candlelight. Doctors today believe George III may have suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that can cause bouts of confusion, hallucinations, and severe pain. Others argue it was bipolar disorder, or some combination of inherited vulnerabilities, again royal inbreeding rearing its spectral head. Historians still debate whether the treatments he received, ice baths, emetics isolation, did more harm than good. Likely they did. But through it all, George wrote letters, hundreds of them, many to you, some to God, and quite a few inexplicably to plants. Yes, tidbit alert, in his worst spells he was said to hold full conversations with an old oak on the palace grounds, referring to it as Lord Bute, his former advisor. Staff were ordered not to cut the tree, lest the king fall into despair. Whether this story is entirely true or court gossip is unclear, but the oak remained untouched for decades. Your life becomes a strange symphony of affection and anxiety. On good days, George is lucid, generous, and almost himself. He plays the organ. He corrects your German grammar. He smiles. But you're always waiting for the shadow to return. And when it does, it's darker each time. By 1810, he's completely withdrawn. Blind. Mute. Confined to Windsor Castle, he lives in almost total isolation, his mind fractured beyond repair. And yet you stay, even after Parliament formally declares your son as Prince Regent, even after advisers suggest you retire quietly and let the men manage affairs of state. You remain the quiet center of the storm, balancing grief and duty with remarkable grace. Modern historians often frame your marriage as tragic, and certainly there's sadness in abundance. But there's also something quietly noble here, something that speaks to the power of commitment, however strained. Your love for George didn't come from passion or politics. It came from years of shared mornings, small kindnesses, and the decision every day to care for someone who could no longer care for himself. And maybe that's why you survive. Not because you were queen, but because you were a woman who knew the difference between pity and love, and chose love again and again. The scent of beeswax, velvet, and oil paint clings to the air as you descend the candlelit halls of the Stockholm Palace. It's the late 1700s, and this isn't your ordinary royal household. No clanging swords or barking generals here. Instead, you hear violins tuning in a side chamber, a baritone humming scales from the corridor, and yes, someone rearranging drapery for dramatic effect. This is the royal world of Gustav III of Sweden, and you, his queen, are about to learn that being married to Gustav is not unlike being trapped inside a never-ending opera. There are costumes, curtain calls, and always a captive audience. You married into this life young noble, and carefully prepared to be a monarch's wife. But Gustav was no ordinary monarch. His heart, it seemed, belonged more to the stage than to any throne. From the moment he rose to power, Gustav transformed the Swedish monarchy into a kind of performance. Court became a playhouse. Ministers became actors. And you were given a script, though it was often unclear which role you were meant to play. From early on, Gustav surrounded himself with painters, poets, and playwrights. He adored the arts with an intensity that rivaled any policy or political alliance. He built the Royal Swedish Opera and personally directed productions, sometimes writing them himself, and often appearing in cameo roles. He even insisted on theatrical protocols at court, how one bowed, how one addressed royalty, how one moved through space. It was all choreographed, all for show. And yet, for all the flamboyance, Gustav was no mere showman. Beneath the powdered wigs and opera scores beat the heart of a reformer. He believed deeply in Enlightenment ideals, education, religious tolerance, and civic responsibility. He pushed to reduce noble privilege and centralize royal power, not for tyranny's sake, but to modernize the state. Historians still argue whether Gustav was an enlightened despot or a visionary ham. Either way, he had a plan, and a costume to match. Being his queen, however, was what complicated. Gustav was gracious and courteous, but distant, warm in public, cool in private. And while he always included you in public ceremonies arm in arm, beaming before his people behind closed doors, your relationship was more formal than affectionate. There were long stretches of silence, separate chambers, and a kind of emotional choreography that felt more theatrical than real. You began to suspect that you were part of a grand tableau, admired, respected, but not truly known. And then, of course, came the matter of children. The pressure to produce an heir weighed on both of you. Whispers rippled through the court about Gustav's reluctance to consummate the marriage. Satirical poems emerged suggesting the king was more enchanted by dances than duchesses. Others speculated he had no interest in physical relationships at all. Some rumors claimed Gustav underwent a medically supervised encounter with you, timed and witnessed, to ensure a legitimate heir, your son, Gustav IV Adolf. Whether this happened precisely as gossiped, or was merely the invention of an amused aristocracy, no one can say. But the tidbit lingered that the conception of a king's heir may have involved not passion, but paperwork and protocol. Your own feelings about this remained largely private. You rarely gave interviews or public statements, but those who served in your court noted your composure, your charitable nature, and the way you quietly took up causes of your own foundling homes, educational societies, and theological study. You found solace in routine in religion, and in your small inner circle of confidants, who didn't expect you to sparkle under chandeliers. Still, Gustav adored being admired. His letters preserved in florid ink often dwelled on aesthetics, how things looked, how things felt, how things might be better, if only the nobles would follow his artistic instincts. In one curious passage, he likened ruling to composing a symphony, the people the melody, the nobles the harmony, the crown the conductor. He truly believed beauty and governance belong together, and perhaps in some ideal world they do. But as the 1790s unfolded, Gustav's vision began to crack. His centralization of power angered the nobility. His reforms once lauded began to look like overreach. Some claimed he fancied himself a philosopher king. Others saw him as a dangerous dreamer, with too much control over the purse strings. Dissent simmered. Then in 1792 it all came crashing down. At a masquerade ball lavish candlelit and staged to perfection, Gustav arrived in a silk costume anonymous among his guests. The ball was to celebrate Lent, a playful final indulgence before the austerity of Easter. Music played, wine flowed, but among the guests lurked conspirators, nobles who believed Gustav had gone too far. A shot rang out. Chaos erupted. Gustav was mortally wounded. What followed was the strangest of royal deaths. The king, a dramatist to the end, refused to die quickly. He lingered for days requesting letters be written, thanking actors for attending, dictating final statements, as though composing the epilogue to his life's work. He died surrounded by candlelight music and meticulously chosen words. And you left behind once again found yourself cloaked, not just in widow's black, but in relief. The pressure, the public theater, the endless scripts it had ended. You were free, but you were also adrift. You retreated from court life, spending your final years quietly in the countryside, tending to charitable projects and corresponding with your surviving friends. You never remarried, never criticized Gustav, never revealed the full truth of your marriage. Historians still debate Gustav III's identity. Was he gay, asexual, emotionally reserved, or simply too devoted to art to make room for love? We may never know. What we do know is that you survived that strange candlelit reign, not through resistance but through quiet patience. And perhaps that's the lesson sometimes. Survival isn't about passion or defiance. Sometimes it's about knowing when to play your part and when to step gently off stage. This time, your royal residence isn't surrounded by candlelit opera houses or the scent of politics in velvet. No, the air here is quiet, almost too quiet. You're in Tokyo, mid-20th century. The shoji doors slide gently in their tracks, and in the garden, a koi fish disturbs the stillness of a pond. The man you're married to doesn't speak much, not even to you. And yet when he does, it's with gravity like each syllable bears the weight of an empire's tradition. Your husband is not a man of theater or temper, but of unshakable routine. Emperor Akihito of Japan, the first son of Hirohito, and the 125th emperor, in a line so old it predates most countries. But while the line may be ancient, your love story is not. When you first met, you weren't royalty. You weren't even nobility. You were a commoner, a young woman named Michiko Shoda, from a well-respected but non-aristocratic family. You played tennis, studied literature, and had never imagined yourself on a coin, much less in a throne room. But then came a chance meeting on a tennis court in Karuizawa, and somehow everything changed. Akihito noticed you first. Your grace, your calm, your firm backhand. The newspapers would later dub it the romance of the century, but at the time it was just a quiet smile exchanged over a tennis net. When Akihito declared his intention to marry you, all of Japan stirred. The idea of a crown prince marrying a commoner, especially one with Catholic schooling and no imperial blood, was radical. Elders in the imperial household were dismayed. Michiko was seen as too modern, too educated, too alive. But Akihito stood firm. For the first time in over 2,600 years of monarchy, a commoner was invited into the sacred chrysanthemum throne. Your wedding was watched by millions. You walked down that imperial path knowing you were breaking history just by taking each step. And then the real challenge began. Life inside the palace was not warm. The older courtiers treated you with suspicion, sometimes cruelty. Rumors swirled that you were unfit, that you didn't understand the dignity of the chrysanthemum. One particularly harsh gossip spread that your mother-in-law, Empress Kojin, refused to speak to you for years. Another whispered that the pressure drove you to collapse, both physically and emotionally, under the invisible weight of generations. There's a curious tidbit that often gets mentioned in retrospectives. For several years you disappeared from the public eye almost entirely. Officially, you were resting. Unofficially, many believed the stress of royal life had triggered a psychological breakdown. Some historians still debate whether this was overblown or understated, whether you were truly crushed by the institution or quietly gathering the strength to stand against it. Akihito, to his credit, never wavered in his support. While he remained respectful of tradition, he also began quietly reshaping the institution from within. He visited disaster sites in person, bowed to survivors, spoke in plain Japanese, rather than court formality. You joined him. Hand in hand, you greeted victims of earthquakes, floods, and sorrow. Together, you became symbols not just of monarchy, but of empathy. And when Akihito became emperor in 1989, following the death of his father, Hirohito, you became the first empress consort in modern Japan who had ever experienced civilian life. Your perspective was different, and slowly people noticed. You modernized palace life in quiet ways. You raised your children more freely. You encouraged open schooling. You introduced informal communication methods and gave interviews previously unheard of for imperial family members. You even made small gestures that broke barriers, hugging children during visits, kneeling to meet people at eye level. Each move, though subtle, chipped away at centuries of rigidity. By the 2000s, public opinion had shifted entirely. What began as controversy became admiration. Japanese citizens, especially women, saw in you not just an empress, but a survivor. A woman who stepped into a silent house and refused to let herself be silenced. And Akihito. In 2019, he did something no Japanese emperor had done in over 2 centuries. He abdicated the throne. Officially, it was due to health concerns. Unofficially, many saw it as an act of love for you, for his people, and for a quieter life in old age. You both stepped down together, hand in hand as you always were, into the realm of history and memory. Historians still argue whether Akihito's marriage to you was a disruption or a revolution. But for many in Japan, it was something far more precious, a reminder that even within institutions built to resist change, love can still write new chapters. And for you, you survived not with fire or protest, but with grace, with patience, with the strength to cry behind closed doors and smile before the world. And perhaps that is the rarest kind of royalty of all. You step softly into the warm halls of Florence. The year is 1770, and candlelight flickers on the high ceilings of the Pitti Palace. The mood is surprisingly calm for a royal household, almost domestic, and you feel it in the air, a strange absence of fear, of hush-hush whispers. Instead, what you hear is something far more unexpected, the low murmur of two voices discussing politics. And one of them is a woman. That woman is Maria Luisa of Spain, Archduchess by title, but in truth far more than just a decorative royal wife. Her husband, Peter Leopold, who would become Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, is sitting beside her listening with genuine curiosity. This is not a scene of intimidation or control. This is not a king imposing orders or making threats behind closed doors. No, what you're seeing here is an actual conversation. He leans in as she speaks. He asks questions. He nods slowly as she makes a point about reforms in the prisons of Tuscany, and then he picks up a quill and begins to write. It feels oddly modern, doesn't it? Peter Leopold wasn't born expecting power. As the younger son of Maria Theresa of Austria, and Francis time he was third in line, overshadowed by siblings like Marie Antoinette and Joseph II. But while others were groomed for throne rooms, Peter was raised almost like a scholar prince. Tutors described him as introspective, calm, and disarmingly rational. And that quiet temperament made him something rare among royals, a man who could listen. When he became Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1765, he entered a world still bound by medieval chains. Torture was legal. The Inquisition was active. Nobles paid almost no taxes. Serfs were tied to the land like trees. And Peter, newly crowned and barely 18, had a choice rule as expected, or change everything. And so he turned to the person he trusted most. Maria Luisa wasn't just any Spanish princess. She was intelligent, articulate, and unusually well-educated for a woman of her era. Fluent in multiple languages, a voracious reader of Enlightenment philosophy, and no stranger to courtly politics, she had grown up watching the Spanish Bourbons manage a fractured empire. But even with all her education, what mattered most in her marriage was the respect it afforded her voice. Where other kings locked their queens out of decision-making, Peter invited his wife into the very heart of it. Together they began discussing legal reform, the first change, abolishing torture, completely, while other monarchs cautiously reduced its use or preserved it for emergencies. Peter struck it down entirely in 1786 with the passage of the Codus Leopoldino, the first criminal code in the world to formally outlaw both torture and capital punishment. Yes, that's right. Before France's revolutionaries guillotined their king, before Britain rethought hanging, Peter Leopold had already abolished the death penalty, and many historians believe Maria Luisa played an active role in these discussions, not merely as an observer, but as an advisor. That same year, Peter pushed through sweeping economic reforms. He rewrote tax codes to include nobles. He banned feudal dues that kept farmers in generational poverty. He launched policies supporting vaccination and improved hygiene. Yes, hygiene, and supported early inoculation campaigns decades before they were fashionable. He even closed many monasteries and redirected church income toward education and public welfare. And what did Maria Luisa do through all this? She stood beside him. Not in front, not behind, beside. She hosted salons for philosophers and physicians. She maintained correspondence with other reform-minded women of Europe. And within the court, she was widely acknowledged as a stabilizing intellectual presence. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. When a plague threatened the outskirts of Florence, Maria Luisa reportedly overrode the palace physician's advice and insisted that quarantine measures be enforced more strictly in certain villages. She cited a book by Bernardino Ramazzini, a pioneering hygienist. Peter backed her up. The outbreak was contained. It wasn't just a marriage. It was a partnership. Now let's be clear, Peter was still a monarch. And like all monarchs, he had his limits. He wasn't immune to ego. Some of his reforms were rolled back after his death. And yes, his successor, his own son Francis II, would prove far more conservative. But in a century known for its opulence and cruelty, Peter Leopold and Maria Luisa's marriage stands out as one of genuine intellectual equality. Historians still debate just how influential Maria Luisa truly was. There are few direct letters from her hand on policy. Some say she shaped his thinking quietly behind the scenes. Others suggest she was a supportive presence, but not a decision-maker. Still, the circumstantial evidence is compelling. Peter repeatedly referred to her as his closest companion, in both state matters and private ones. When traveling, he brought her along not just as consort, but as counsel, and the reforms he introduced consistently reflected a concern for everyday human dignity, a trait his contemporaries often traced to her compassionate nature. You imagine what that must have felt like in the palace, being a woman whose opinion mattered. Not because of family lineage or dowry, but because of insight. Perhaps that's why the court servants referred to their relationship, half in jest, as una repubblica di due, a republic of two. Let's not forget that this all occurred in the 18th century. Women couldn't vote. Most couldn't own property. Many couldn't even choose their own husbands. And yet here was Maria Luisa, advising on legal codes, weighing in on vaccination strategy, helping design public education programs. Quietly, respectfully, but unmistakably, she was changing history. When Peter ascended to the imperial throne as Holy Roman Emperor in 1790, following the death of his brother Joseph II, Maria Luisa followed him to Vienna. But she didn't live long afterward. She died suddenly in 1792 at just 44 years old. The court mourned deeply, but none more than Peter. He never remarried. Instead, he spent his final years reflecting on what he called the lost conversation, the intellectual companionship he'd shared with her, which no courtier or minister could replace. He once wrote in a private letter that ruling without her is like sailing without a compass. And now, centuries later, as you drift between candlelit corridors and soft night sounds, you might wonder what would have happened if more royal marriages were like theirs. If more rulers had listened, not just to generals and priests, but to their partners. Maybe there would have been fewer wars, fewer heads on spikes, fewer revolutions born of royal deafness. Of course, there's no way to know, but for one brief moment in the city of Florence, a king and a queen rewrote what marriage in power could be. Not a stage, not a battlefield, but a dialogue. The air is hot, dry, and humming heavy with the scent of warm stone and lotus. You blink slowly, your eyes adjusting to the glare of the Egyptian sun, as it glints off alabaster columns and scorches the golden sand at your feet. But this is no ordinary stroll through history. You're in ancient Thebes, walking in the long shadow of a colossal ruler. Behind you, servants murmur. Ahead, the gates to Abu Simbel loom. And beside you, always beside you, is the woman every scribe in the land calls beloved of the goddess. Her name is Nefertari. And your husband, he is Rameses II, builder of empires, carver of colossi, slayer of Hittites, at least in stone relief father to perhaps 100 children, and self-declared master of the two lands. But while his name might echo with power, this part of the story isn't about conquest. It's about love, or at least the closest thing to love that ever made its way into temple inscriptions and hieroglyphs carved for eternity. You wouldn't expect softness from a pharaoh who built more statues of himself than any ruler before or after. And yet walk into the smaller temple at Abu Simbel, the one not dedicated to Ra or Amun, but to a woman, and you'll feel something different. Ramesses had this entire temple carved for Nefertari, not just with her name tucked into a corner. No, she stands equal in size to the king himself, equal in status, equal in beauty according to the poetic inscriptions she for whom the sun shines. It's easy to think of Rameses II as a ruler who loved monuments more than people. He reigned for 66 years, commissioned over a dozen major temples, and reshaped Egypt's landscape in his image. But even among all that stone and grandeur, Nefertari remained a constant. In inscriptions, she's often called the one for whom he built everything. And that's not a poetic exaggeration. Historians still marvel at the level of prominence he gave her, especially for a royal wife, in a time when women were often honored only in death. When you marry Rameses, you're not his only wife. Far from it. He has concubines, secondary wives, palace dances. He marries several of his daughters even. Some for alliance, others for tradition. It's uncomfortable, yes, but such was the world of dynastic Egypt, where bloodlines were sacred and power flowed through temples and genes alike. And yet in all that swirl of ritual and possession, there is only one woman whose name is spoken with poetry. Nefertari's titles go beyond the usual. She's not just great royal wife. She is mistress of charm, lady of the two lands, sweet of love. And she's not silent either. Reliefs show her participating in state ceremonies, possibly advising on matters of diplomacy. Some scholars believe she may have played a key role in relations with the Hittites, especially after the famed Battle of Kadesh. Ramesses liked to portray that battle as a roaring success, of course, with him alone in a chariot fending off armies. The truth, it was more of a stalemate, and peace had to be negotiated carefully. Here's where it gets interesting among the diplomatic letters recovered from ancient archives. There's mention of female correspondence, likely queenly advisors discussing terms. Some Egyptologists argue Nefertari's educated status and prominence make her a probable candidate. Historians still debate the extent of her influence, of course. Was she truly political, or simply honored as a divine consort? But even the possibility places her in rare company. And there's another unusual detail. Nefertari was literate, in a world where most women indeed, most men could not read. Nefertari's literacy was symbolically and practically powerful. One temple inscription shows her playing the sistrum, a sacred rattle, associated with Hathor, goddess of beauty and joy. But in another more telling image, she holds a scroll, a papyrus, a sign that her knowledge was not ornamental. It had weight. As for their relationship, it's tempting in our modern longing for romance to read into the art and architecture too deeply. But there's something undeniably personal in the way Ramesses had her depicted. In many carvings, their hands touch not always the norm. Their bodies face one another. And the text doesn't just exalt her beauty. It praises her counsel, her wisdom, her ability to soothe the gods and perhaps at times her husband. Quirky tidbit. At Nefertari's tomb, QV 66 in the Valley of the Queens, you'll find what is often called the most beautifully decorated tomb in all of Egypt. The walls are covered in vibrant scenes from the Book of the Dead, showing her graceful journey through the underworld. The artistic style is unusually refined, suggesting that only the best artists were employed for her burial. And here's the kicker. Her tomb is significantly larger and more elaborate than many pharaohs. That's not just affection, that's architectural reverence. But life with Ramesses wasn't a moonlit stroll through lotus fields. As queen, your days are scheduled, ceremonial, and exhausting. You rise before the sun to perform rituals. You're expected to maintain a flawless appearance to mediate between gods and mortals. You walk barefoot through incense smoke and chant blessings, with a voice that must not quiver. And all the while you know that in the great court, your husband is being flattered, obeyed, and exalted as divine. To share space with a man proclaimed to be a god while remaining fully human takes a kind of quiet bravery. And then, sometime around year 25 of Ramesses' reign, you disappear from the records. There is no grand final scene, no dramatic death etched in stone, just silence. Most scholars believe you died young, perhaps in your 40s, long before Ramesses' reign was finished. He would go on to live into his 90s, marrying others, building more fathering generations. But still, he never had another queen whose image was carved so often, so equally, so beautifully. Even his beloved daughters elevated, though they were never quite replaced you. When you walk past his later monuments, you notice something odd. The temples grow larger, the statues more imposing, but the warmth is missing, the poetry absent. His inscriptions shift from love to legacy, from personal to political, and perhaps in that there's a quiet mourning. Historians often struggle with these moments. Was it real love? Was Nefertari truly unique to Ramesses, or simply the best-timed consort during his most creative period? We don't know for certain, but the records do give us hints. There's a famous inscription from the Abu Simbel temple that reads, "My love is with her more than any other." And it's not hidden away in some private scroll, it's chiseled into stone for the gods and generations to witness. For a man who referred to himself as a living deity, Rameses rarely shared the stage. But with Nefertari he did. That's what makes this marriage different. You don't survive a royal marriage like this through beauty alone. You survive it by understanding when to speak and when to step back, when to soothe, when to advise, when to hold your dignity like a scepter, and when to let love, even if ceremonial, bloom into something that lasts longer than life. Even now, archaeologists still whisper about Nefertari's tomb. It's been damaged by time, yes, but her painted face still gazes out with that knowing, serene smile. The kind that says she knew her name would never be forgotten. And it hasn't. Thousands of years later, tourists still come to see her to trace her outline with camera lenses, to marvel at a woman who was both consort and queen muse and mind. And perhaps most stunning of all, Rameses made sure of it. You arrive not in a palace, but in a world of velvet discomfort and powdered expectations. Versailles, grand, gleaming a golden cage, stretches before you like a stage, and the audience is always watching. Inside its salons, gossip hangs heavier than the perfume. And somewhere beyond the gilded mirrors and ticking clocks, a teenage boy is nervously avoiding his bride. Welcome to the early marriage of Louis Auguste, soon to be Louis XVII of France, and Maria Antonia of Austria, whom the French will quickly rename Marie Antoinette. Theirs was a marriage not built on love, nor even compatibility, but on centuries of warfare. For over 100 years, France and Austria had glared at each other across the battlefield. This union between the French Dauphin and the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa was a carefully arranged truce, stitched with lace and sealed with ink. You're 13, maybe 14, sent from your homeland, with a retinue of dresses and not a single familiar face. And when you meet your new husband for the first time, he mumbles a few words, bows awkwardly, and disappears. It is not a grand romance, not yet. In fact, it's a comedy of hesitation. Louis is shy, painfully so, more interested in locks and hunting than in ballroom etiquette or feminine company. He stammers in conversation. He prefers the quiet solitude of the forge, where he can take apart and reassemble door mechanisms for hours on end. And you're lively, charming, but utterly out of place in this icy court, where everything, your accent, your walk, even how you curtsy, is under scrutiny. The pressure is immediate and enormous. You're expected to produce heirs, soon. The Bourbon dynasty is fragile, and the court whispers endlessly about the lack of consummation. Satirical pamphlets appear mocking Louis as impotent, and Marie as frigid. In truth, they are simply young, awkward, terrified. Too much was expected of them too fast. It would take 7 years before the marriage was fully consummated. Historians still argue about why. Was it a physical condition? A psychological block? A mutual lack of knowledge? Some point to phimosis, a condition Louis may have suffered from, later reportedly corrected by minor surgery. Others believe it was simply inexperience and crushing anxiety. The truth, like the bedchamber door, remains closed. But slowly, very slowly, something tender begins to bloom. Louis, though hesitant, is not cruel. He gives Marie Antoinette a private garden, where she can escape the formal suffocation of Versailles. He begins joining her in her salons, attending her musical performances. He laughs occasionally at her teasing. When their first child, a daughter, is finally born in 1778, he cradles her proudly. His letters, though clumsy, speak of devotion. "You are the solace of my life," he writes once, not to a mistress or courtier, but to his wife. And Marie, for all her infamous indulgences, is not heartless. She defends Louis against cruel pamphlets calling him good, kind, and honest. She begins to understand his vulnerabilities and protects them. In private, they share long walks, candlelit dinners, and the kind of quiet intimacy that doesn't make it into history books, but shapes a life nonetheless. Quirky tidbit: Louis once gifted Marie Antoinette a hand-carved mechanical lock as a romantic gesture. She reportedly kept it by her writing desk. Their relationship becomes one not of passion, but of companionship. A shy kind of love, a kind that might have grown into something stable, even beautiful if not for the storm already gathering at the gates. Outside Versailles, France is seething. Decades of financial mismanagement wars and growing inequality are ready to explode. Marie Antoinette becomes an easy target. Foreign fashionable and misunderstood, she's caricatured as extravagant, immoral, and manipulative. The infamous line, "Let them eat cake," is falsely attributed to her and sticks like glue. Louis, for his part, is seen as indecisive, weak, and out of touch. But inside the palace, they are simply trying to hold things together. Louis reforms taxes, ends torture in interrogations, and supports religious tolerance. Marie Antoinette quietly funds charities, builds hospitals, and adopts several orphaned children. But the tide of public opinion will not be turned. They are symbols now, not people, and symbols cannot weep. Still, they cling to each other. When the revolution erupts in 1789, the royal couple is forced to flee Versailles for Paris. The palace is looted. Their lives are upended. The lavish halls give way to confinement. They live under watch, their letters censored, their children manipulated. But even then, their connection remains. In the Temple prison, Louis and Marie Antoinette still share meals. She reads to him. He teaches their son history. And in the final days, when all is lost, Louis writes a last letter to his wife, urging her to forgive their enemies and care for their children. "I die innocent," he writes, "and I forgive those who have condemned me." Marie's own final letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, is a masterclass in dignity. "I am calm," she writes, as one whose conscience is clear. She speaks of her husband with love. She mourns the separation from her children. She does not rage. She does not beg. When Louis is executed by guillotine in January 1793, Marie Antoinette is devastated but composed. 9 months later, she too is taken to the scaffold. No crown, no powdered wigs, just a simple white dress and bound hands. She walks to her death with her head held high. And now, as you wander the faded corridors of Versailles, the opulence seems hollow. The mirrors reflect not just splendor, but sorrow. The tapestries whisper not just wealth, but warning. Were Louis and Marie perfect rulers? No. They were slow to change, bound by outdated rituals, and at times astonishingly unaware of the suffering outside their gates. But they were not monsters. They were human. Two young people thrown into an impossible role, trying awkwardly, gently to make it work. Historians still debate their marriage. Was it ever truly romantic? Was Marie Antoinette faithful, or did she seek affection elsewhere? Did Louis love her deeply, or simply rely on her presence? These questions linger unsolved, but what remains is a record of two lives trying to meet in the middle amid unimaginable pressure. And perhaps in the quiet exchanges between them, in the gifts of keys and letters, in the shared gardens and whispered conversations, there was something real, something soft, something shy. And now, as you sit back from this long, strange parade of royal husbands, kings who sang, who suffered, who schemed, who simply stumbled the question, finally drifts to the surface like mist on the Seine. What is it really that makes a man worthy of being called great? Is it the crown, the armies, the palaces filled with golden clocks? Or is it something quieter, something softer, something that doesn't glitter under chandeliers? You've seen it all, haven't you? You were there when Ferdinand VII turned his pain inward and let it rot into paranoia. You walked the halls with Maria Cristina as she counted the price of an heir. You wept for Maria Isabel's unraveling, flinched at the sounds behind closed doors, and watched an entire nation twist itself around the wounded soul of one deeply troubled man. That kind of monarchy, absolute, unchecked, deeply personal, it leaves more scars than legacies. But it also teaches a truth many prefer to ignore, that a crown does not sanctify a person. It does not erase cruelty or excuse fear, or elevate dysfunction into destiny. Still, you kept walking. You followed the thread into different courts, different lives. And what you found, perhaps to your surprise, was not always sorrow. In George III, there was loyalty and love letters, even as he lost himself to madness. In Gustav III, a theatrical spirit, whose eccentricities played out on stage instead of in shadow. In Akihito of Japan, you saw courage, quiet and revolutionary, as he chose a commoner for love, and stood beside her against centuries of expectation. Some kings ruled with noise, others with music. A few, like Peter Leopold of Tuscany, ruled by listening. His reforms didn't spring from ambition, but from empathy, and from the counsel of a wife he actually respected. You may have blinked at that. A royal man in the 1700s valuing a woman's thoughts in matters of state. Historians still argue about just how much power Maria Luisa held. But the fact that anyone has to ask says something. It says her voice wasn't just heard, it was remembered. And then came the warmth. The golden Nile light of Rameses II and his beloved Nefertari. Their love was carved into temple walls and etched into poems, not because it was perfect, but because it endured. Rameses had many wives, that was tradition, but he elevated Nefertari to the heavens. Literally, he built her a temple at Abu Simbel, where she stands alongside gods. Her name, over 3,000 years later, still glows in limestone. After that, you wandered into Versailles, where Louis and Marie began as strangers under pressure, and somehow forged a quiet kind of tenderness. They didn't rule well, perhaps history was too large for them, but they tried. They tried to love each other, to hold their family close, to stand with dignity, even when the guillotine cast its shadow. You've seen a spectrum now, not just of monarchy, but of masculinity. And maybe that's what this story was always about, not just the dangers of marrying the wrong king, but the deeper truth that power is never enough. Not to make a man good, not to make a woman safe, not to make a marriage gentle. One historical fact clings to memory as you drift into this last thought: in nearly every monarchy, the role of queen was defined not by choice, but by proximity. Born or married into it, women were expected to endure. They were to be beautiful, fruitful, loyal, silent. But the men, the men, were allowed to be anything. Scholars, tyrants, poets, addicts. They could shape empires or sabotage them with a shrug. And history would still call them sovereign. Quirky tidbit. In the 18th century, a minor German duke once petitioned to be called His Serene Highness and Unquestionable Husband. His wife was not consulted. Historians still debate what monarchy was really for. Was it divine right, a necessary political structure, a gilded illusion to keep the lower classes compliant? Maybe it was all of those. Or maybe it was just a mirror one that reflected back, not the glory of God, but the flaws of men. And so here you are, lying in bed, blinking up at the ceiling. Your thoughts flicker between stone palaces and velvet beds, between swords and love letters, between what was and what might have been. You remember the cold marble of a royal bathroom, the soft whisper of a queen's gown on polished floors, the sound of a reluctant husband fumbling with a mechanical lock instead of reaching for her hand. You remember that not all kings were cruel. Some were confused. Some were simply human. And you remember, too, that in every story, even the darkest ones, there were always glimmers of light. So maybe the lesson isn't just that you wouldn't survive being married to a king. Maybe it's that you shouldn't have to. that the world should never again demand that a woman endure suffering just to uphold a crown, that power without compassion is a brittle thing, and that true strength, the kind that matters, doesn't come from lineage or titles or inherited robes. It comes from kindness. And so, with all these royal ghosts at your side, Ferdinand with his secrets, George with his trees, Akihito with his quiet strength, you close your eyes. Their stories settle beside you like old embroidered quilts. Heavy, strange, but no longer frightening. Because now you know the crown doesn't make the man. It never did. The room is quiet now. You feel the hush of history pulling its velvet curtain closed, the murmurs of 1,000 court whispers, fading into a sleepy stillness. There are no more queens to console, no more kings to decipher. Just you, the softness of the pillow, and the long exhale of stories well told. Let the flickering torchlight in the palace halls dim into candle glow. Let the creak of royal boots vanish into the hush of silk slippers. You've traveled through centuries tonight, across Europe and Egypt, across heartbreak and hope, and you did it all by listening. Maybe your life is not lined in gold or echoed in marble, but it is yours. And unlike the royal brides we met, you get to choose. Choose how to love, how to speak, how to sleep without fear. No arranged marriages, no velvet prisons, just quiet. Let that thought soothe you now that history was loud, but you can be soft. That power left scars, but you can rest unmarked. That behind every mighty king there was often a woman holding her breath, dreaming of a night just like this, peaceful, free, untouched by politics, or duty, or pain. So close your eyes. Let Marie's garden bloom behind your lids. Let Nefertari's temple bathe your thoughts in golden light. Let the sound of scribbled love letters and whispered bedtime secrets wrap around you like a lullaby from the past. You've made it through, and tomorrow the world will still be yours, not gilded, but kind. Sweet dreams.